The old wooden gate creaked in protest as the silver SUV roared straight through it, splinters flying in the early evening sun. Dust exploded across the gravel road, and Jake had to turn his head to keep the grit out of his eyes. He stood on the porch, boots planted firmly, fists tightening as the same car he'd seen a dozen times sped off down his private trail like it belonged there. His jaw worked, but he didn't say a word. Not that Karen could have heard him over the screaming tires anyway. The latch was busted clean off, again. Jake sighed, pulling his hat lower on his brow as the tail lights disappeared over the ridge. A couple of the cattle lowed nervously from the pasture. One of the younger calves pressed against the fence line, jittery from the commotion, while the older steers just stared dumbly after the dust cloud like it was all routine. And in a way it was. 3 times this week. He muttered, voice gravelly. 3 damn times. Jake had lived on this land his whole life. His father built the first section of fence with his own hands, hammering nails under the hot sun. The gate was meant to be simple. A boundary that said, this is ours. Respect it. It wasn't just wood and wire, it was history, family, and the blood and sweat of generations. Folks around here understood that. Everyone but Karen. She wasn't even from around here. Moved in 2 years back to a fancy house on the other side of the ridge. HO president, or self-proclaimed queen of the cold D-Sec. Jake wasn't sure which. What he did know was that ever since she'd figured out his dirt road cut 10 minutes off her drive into town, she'd been hell-bent on using it like it was hers. At first, he thought it was a mistake. He caught her SUV rattling down the road one morning and waved her down. He tipped his hat, tried to be polite, told her this was private property. She'd smiled at him in that brittle way some folks do when they're not really listening, and said, don't worry, I'm not hurting anything. Then she'd driven on. The second time, he stood in front of the gate, arms crossed. Ma'am, this isn't a through road. I've got livestock out here. Can't have folks tearing through. She rolled down her window and gave him a look like he was a child throwing a tantrum. I have every right to take the fastest route, she said, nose wrinkling like the smell of hay offended her. Your little gate won't stop me. And she had laughed. Laughed like the whole damn thing was a joke. Now, watching the ruined gate sway in the warm breeze, Jake felt that laugh echo in his chest like an ember glowing hotter with every breath. He pulled his gloves from his back pocket and walked down to the wreckage, the crunch of gravel under his boots steady, deliberate. He crouched, running his hand over the splintered post. Another repair, another waste of time. The sun was dipping low, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and purple. The crickets had started their evening song, but all Jake could hear was the faint rattle of Karen's exhaust still drifting across the valley. He clenched his jaw and stood, scanning the line of fence. It wasn't just about a shortcut anymore. This was disrespect, plain and simple. He'd called the sheriff once months back, after she nearly clipped one of his cows barreling down the trail. The deputy came out, wrote up a warning, shook his head like he'd seen it all before. Some folks don't learn easy, he'd said, sliding the ticket book back in his pocket. Best thing you can do is put up a better gate. So Jake did. Reinforced hinges, thicker posts, a new lock. Karen busted through it within the week. He told himself not to let it eat at him, not to waste the energy. The ranch had more than enough work to keep a man occupied. Fences to mend, stock to feed, machinery to keep running. But every time he saw her SUV kick up dust on his road, it burned a little deeper. She wasn't just ignoring him. She was mocking him. Jake leaned against the fence rail, staring out over the field. The cattle had settled back down, heads bent low to graze, tails flicking lazily. Life kept moving slow and steady, the way it always had on this land. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the scent of hay and earth. Normally it was enough to calm him, remind him what mattered. Tonight it wasn't. He remembered his father's voice, firm and measured. A man's land is his word. You let someone walk all over it. They'll never stop. They'll take until there's nothing left. Jake kicked a broken board aside and set his jaw. Karen wasn't going to stop. She thought she was untouchable. That her HO rules and suburban smile meant more than generations of work and respect. She didn't understand the ranch. She didn't understand boundaries. But she was going to. The stars were just beginning to prick the sky when Jake walked back toward the house. He paused on the porch, glancing once more at the ruined gate silhouetted against the darkening horizon. His hands curled into fists, then relaxed. He wasn't a man who picked fights. But he knew how to finish them. Enough's enough, he said quietly to himself, the words hanging in the cooling air. The crickets hummed louder, and the wind rustled the grass like it was listening. Jake turned and stepped inside, his mind already working. If Karen thought a simple wooden gate was all that stood between her and his land, she was in for a lesson. A lesson she'd never forget. And this time, she wouldn't laugh. 2 nights later, the ranch was so quiet it almost felt like it was holding its breath. The air carried that sharp autumn edge, cool enough to raise the hairs on Jake's arms as he walked the fence line with a flashlight. The coyotes had started their chorus somewhere in the distance, yelping and howling at a sliver of moon hanging pale in the sky. It was the kind of night when every sound carried, from the rustle of grass to the low hoot of an owl in the cottonwoods. The new gate stood tall and solid, just like Jake intended. From the outside it looked almost the same as the old one. Weathered wood, the same hand-cut boards, even a fresh coat of dust brushed on to dull the shine of new lumber. But beneath the surface was steel, welded into place with hours of sparks and sweat. Heats deeper, filled the bases with concrete, and bolted the hinges straight through reinforced beams. It wasn't going anywhere this time. A small red light blinked faintly from a motion-triggered camera he'd mounted on a post. Another sat further down the line, angled to catch headlights as they came over the ridge. He wasn't much for technology, but after the last few weeks, he figured it was time to fight fire with fire. He wanted proof. Undeniable, clear as day proof. Jake leaned against the fence rail, pulling off his gloves. He could feel the tension buzzing under his skin, the same way the cattle get restless before a storm. He wasn't nervous, not exactly. Just waiting. Waiting for the inevitable. He knew Karen too well by now. She wasn't going to quit. The hours crept by, the moon rising higher, shadows stretching long across the fields. Jake almost thought maybe she'd decided to take the hint, maybe she'd found some other shortcut to bother with. But faint at first, he heard it. The distant hum of an engine. His head snapped up. The sound grew louder, echoing against the ridge, bouncing down the valley. He could see the glow before the car itself, a smear of headlights cresting the rise like a predator's eyes. His pulse kicked harder, steady, as the silver SUV came into view, barreling down the dirt road in a spray of dust. Same as always. Same arrogance, same carelessness. Jake crouched low, hand recording. The camera's red light blinked steady, watching. Karen didn't slow. She never slowed. The SUV roared, gravel spitting under its tires as it charged straight for the gate like it was tissue paper. Jake almost felt sorry for her, almost warned her in his head. But the thought passed quick. She'd had her warnings. More than enough. The impact shook the night. Bang! The sound was like thunder cracking against the earth. Metal crunched and groaned, headlights shattered in a spray of glass, and the gate held firm, immovable. The SUV folded against it with a sickening screech, the hood crumpling like a tin can under a boot heel. Airbags exploded inside with a muffled pop, white fabric blooming against the windshield. Dust rose in a choking cloud around the wreck. For a moment, the whole ranch went silent, as if even the coyotes were stunned. Jake's boots crunched slow and deliberate against the gravel as he walked forward, his phone still recording. The driver's side door wrenched open with effort, and Karen stumbled out, coughing, her perfectly ironed blouse smeared with dust and the acrid smell of burned rubber clinging to her. Her hair was wild, her face twisted with rage more than fear. You set me up, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at him. Jake stopped a few paces away, calm as a man watching rain fall. No, he said evenly, voice low but carrying across the quiet. You set yourself up. I told you this wasn't your road. Her eyes darted from the wrecked SUV to the solid gate standing unbroken, to the blinking red lights of the cameras. For the first time, he saw the flash of panic beneath the fury. This is entrapment, she snapped. You can't do this to me. I'll sue. You'll lose everything. Jake almost smiled, but his expression stayed steady. Entrapment's when you're tricked into committing a crime. I didn't trick you. I warned you. Over and over. And now I've got it all on record. She sputtered, red blotches spreading across her cheeks. I'm the HO president. Do you know what that means? Fit means nothing out here, Jake said, turning his phone so the camera caught the whole scene. The wrecked SUV, the broken Pride standing next to it. Out here, respect means everything. And you've been fresh out of that since the day you moved in. She tried to bluster, tried to shout over him, but the shrillness in her voice cracked under the weight of the situation. The cameras blinked on, steady witnesses. The sheriff would see, the court would see, everyone would see. Jake walked past her, giving the gate a firm tug just to prove it still held. Solid as stone. He let his hand rest on the cool steel hidden beneath the wood, a quiet satisfaction humming through him. Months of frustration, of watching his land treated like a doormat, ended in this one undeniable moment. Karen stood frozen, her SUV hissing smoke behind her. You'll regret this, she whispered, though the fire in her eyes was already dimming under the weight of what she'd done. Jake tipped his hat, voice calm as ever. Not half as much as you do right now. By the time the sheriff arrived, lights flashing across the quiet ranch, Jake had already sent the footage. Karen tried again to spin her story. How she'd been targeted, how he'd tricked her. But the sight of the reinforced gate, the wrecked car, and the recorded proof left little room for lies. The deputy took one long look, then shook his head. Ma'am, you're looking at trespassing charges, property damage fines, and reckless endangerment. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, but no words came. For once she was speechless. Jake leaned back against the fence rail, arms crossed, watching the night settle again as the sheriff's men finished their work. The cattle had barely stirred, the crickets sang on, and the stars wheeled overhead like they always did. For the first time in weeks, the gate stood tall, unbroken, untouchable. And Jake, with a quiet grin tugging at the corner of his mouth, knew it would stay that way. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way.